Are you a scholar, journalist, or writer focused on Palestine? Contribute to the foremost journal on the past, present, and future of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Quarterly is soliciting articles for peer review, essays, and letters from Jerusalem. Send your work to jq@palestine-studies.org or see palestine-studies.org/journals for more info.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is the Dakaka Award winner for 2023 of the Jerusalem Quarterly, Fadi Ragheb. Fadi will publish with the Jerusalem Quarterly, and he won the award with an article sharing the Holy Land, Islamic pilgrimage to Christian holy sites in Jerusalem during the late medieval and early modern periods. First of all, congratulations and welcome.
Thank you, Roberto.
I want to ask, just a very basic question, just to kick off for those that may not know you. If you can tell us something about yourself and how you came to work on late medieval Jerusalem.
Sure. Basically, I began my academic journey in Islamic history very early on by doing a BA at McGill University. I focused on studying modern history, basically more modern European and Middle Eastern history. And after finishing my degree at McGill, I worked for a few years, but then the academic history itch started to gnaw at me again, especially with the events that were occurring in the Middle East. For example, after the American invasion of Iraq, all the tensions in Syria and the Arab Spring. So I decided to basically go back to the academe and do my MA and PhD at the University of Toronto. Now, although my BA was in modern history, I've decided to focus on the medieval world because I felt that in order to understand the modern events of the Middle East, whether it's, Sunni-Shia tensions, Arab-Israeli conflict, regional and international foreign policy and crises, I really felt that an understanding of the medieval Islamic world is necessary. And in fact, when I teach my students the history of the Crusades, I teach a course on the Crusades and the Islamic perspectives on the Crusades. I always tell them that the Middle East is one of the very few regions in the world that in order to understand what is happening today, there's absolutely no way to understand it fully without comprehending the medieval period. And let me tell you that going back to doing my studies on medieval Islamic history did not disappoint because true to my belief, the events in the medieval world really help us understand and illuminate the modern period, including the Arab-Israeli conflict and today's political and demographic tensions within the city of Jerusalem. While studying my MA and PhD, I decided to focus on the crusading period because I had an interest from a young age on the Crusades. I used to watch the movie Al-Nasr Salah ad-Din by Yusuf Shaheen, and it was about Richard and Saladin. So I had a fascination of that period. And from there, I came to study medieval Islamic Jerusalem and to focus specifically on the Fada'il al-Quds, which are Islamic pilgrimage guides on Jerusalem during the medieval period.
I'm very curious about your studies on the Crusades, because if I think about the regular Western, particularly European curriculum, or the Crusades are mostly seen through the eyes of European history. So this movement that left Europe a different period of time, and eventually made it into the Middle East. And, there's some sense of criticism about the massacres that were committed. But essentially, this is the main framework through which the Crusades were seen. And I was wondering if you had a chance to study and look at the Crusades from a different perspective.
Well, basically, in my study of the age of the Crusades, I focused on the Islamic responses to the Crusades, much more than focusing on the medieval European side of the epoch. In fact, the age of the Crusades is quite a dense and complex field that, as Stephen Humphreys once said, that in order to master the age of the Crusades, you'll have to learn 5 to 6 languages and consult so many different kind of literary and archaeological and documentary evidence. But the Crusades, when we listen to the massacres, when we read about the massacres of Muslims during the First Crusade, that is when the Franks conquered Jerusalem, the chronicles speak about the massacres of tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews, and that there were the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from the city. I mean, the numbers sometimes might be a bit deceptive because chroniclers they're writing for their own audiences, so they might exaggerate the numbers. And similarly, that is not only from the Muslim side, but also from the Frankish Crusader side. They would exaggerate their victories and exaggerate the killings that they've done, or the battles, the events on the battles. So when we read the chronicles of the Crusades and the primary source of the Crusades, we have to look at it in a bit of a more objective and distant view, and to understand the context in which those chroniclers wrote. They were religious figures, some of them were bureaucratic figures. So reading those sources and understanding whether it's massacres, battles, events, treachery within the Islamic camp or within the Frankish camp, we have to look at these events with a grain of salt and be a bit more aware of why is the chronicler writing that, or to whom is this chronicler writing and addressing. So it's a bit more complex a topic, and would require a bit more of analysis and explication here.
So let me move to the fact that you won the Dakar Award of the Jerusalem Quarterly with an article discussing Islamic pilgrimage to Christian holy sites in Jerusalem during the late medieval and early modern period. So can you start telling us how Jerusalem would have looked like in the late medieval era? Who are the people living there? How would have the city look like in terms of your urban structures? And if there's any legacy that can still be seen today of that period?
Well, we have to, when we think of medieval Jerusalem, we'll have to think of 2 periods. There's the medieval Islamic period before the age of the Crusades, and the later medieval Islamic period, which is what I wrote my article and my dissertation on, which is the Mamluk period. That is after the vanquish of the Crusader states in the Middle East, in the Islamic world. So I will speak about the Mamluk period first, because I will address the earlier Islamic period later. After the expulsion of the Crusader states in the Islamic world around the middle of the 13th century, Jerusalem was quite ravaged. For example, the walls of Jerusalem at that time were destroyed. They were destroyed during the 13th century, the early 13th century. So the Mamluks, who took over reign of Egypt and Palestine and Syria, and they were the ones who defeated fully the Franks, and they also defeated the Mongols at that time. They began to rebuild Jerusalem. They rebuilt it both architecturally, urbanly, and as well ideologically. In what way? They started to really put their efforts to re-emphasizing the Islamic character of Jerusalem during the Mamluk period. For example, a lot of Mamluk upper echelons, like emirs and sultans, visited Jerusalem, and a lot of emirs also settled there. They retired there and spent the rest of their lives there. So those upper echelons invested financial endowments in the city to build all kinds of madrasas, Islamic schools, to build lodges for pilgrims, to build Sufi worship houses like ribats and khanqas, So Jerusalem became a bustling place for pilgrims. Pilgrims both that are Muslim coming from across the central Islamic lands and as well as from Europe. For example, Jonathan Sumption reminds us that beginning with the 11th century, all the way through the age of the Crusades and after, Jerusalem entered what we call the Great Age of Pilgrimage for European Christians. So the city was bustling with both Muslim pilgrims visiting the city and Christian pilgrims at the same time. One important aspect of the city's demographics is that every year, hundreds, if not thousands, of Muslim pilgrims that are heading to the Hajj in Mecca would actually stop in Jerusalem to perform what we call the Haram, the purification ritual that all pilgrims to Mecca should perform before beginning the Hajj. So after Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem, for example, you read in the chronicles that thousands of Muslims came every year to begin their journey to Mecca from Jerusalem. So you have the city bustling with pilgrims, Muslims and Christians. You also see a lot of construction. You see a lot of Mamluk religious building around the Haram. In fact, the old city of Jerusalem today, as modern scholars argue, is basically a Mamluk city because the Mamluks invested so much money and efforts and energies to build all kinds of institutions around the Haram and even deep within the city proper of Jerusalem. So the city grew in population. Religiously and ideologically, Islam has become the primary faith once again after the extirpation of the Franks from the city. And this is reflected in what I'm studying on, what I'm focusing on. It's reflected in the significant proliferation of writings on Jerusalem in the form of medieval Islamic pilgrimage guides, the Fada'il al-Quds, which translates loosely as the merits of Jerusalem. So we see tens of Fada'il al-Quds pilgrimage guides being written by leading Islamic scholars at the time to both extol, sanctify, and encourage and attract Muslims to come and visit Jerusalem. So this is also coupled with another parallel, which is at the same time writings by European Christian pilgrims visiting Jerusalem also proliferated, and we see an exponential growth in writings on Jerusalem from European visitors as well.
We will talk about the merits of Jerusalem later, but I really want to talk about the question of the Islamic pilgrimage to Christian holy sites. Can you tell us a little bit more about this practice?
Islamic pilgrimage to Christian holy sites or just holy
Yes,
sites in general?
to Christian holy sites. And perhaps you can start discussing, Islamic pilgrimage to the various sites in Jerusalem, but specifically to Christian holy sites.
Sure. Well, that was the interesting aspect about me studying and researching the Fada'il al-Quds, because in today's world, we believe there's this strict division between Muslims and Christians, Muslims visiting Muslim holy sites, Christians visiting Christian holy sites. In fact, when I started researching the Fada'il al-Quds, we begin to see that there is an itinerary for Muslims to go around the city and perform pilgrimage and worship at a circuit of holy sites that include Christian holy sites. For example, the Fada'il al-Quds guides encourage Muslims to visit certain important Christian holy sites, such as the Mount of Olives, the Church of the Sepulcher of Mary there, the Church of the Ascension, and interestingly enough, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. So within the Fada'il al-Quds literature, you see that some of those churches are actually sanctified and connected with Christian figures that are also extolled and basically lauded in the Islamic tradition, such as Jesus, Mary, John the Baptist, etc. And even the network of Christian holy sites extends to Bethlehem and Nazareth. So you begin to see in the Fada'il al-Quds that Christian holy sites are sanctified and included within the circuit of pilgrimage that Muslims should perform around the city. Now, why do I refer to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as, interestingly, it is also there? It's because, as we know, within the Islamic theology, there is this, debate or disagreement on the crucifixion of Jesus. So within the Islamic tradition, it's believed that Jesus was not crucified, but he actually passed away naturally. So the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, which is the spot where Jesus was crucified and laid down, is actually not looked at favorably in the Fada'il al-Quds. So it is basically forbidden for Muslims to visit the church there. However, the Fada'il al-Quds and the chroniclers as well, they refer to the fact that Muslims had been visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulcher for centuries, even though strict Islamic law under the Hanbalis, the most conservative, say that this holy site should not be worshipped or should not be visited by Muslims. Less conservative Sunnis from the Shafi'i madhab began to incorporate this debate and discussion about should Muslims visit holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. And they said, well, yes, you could visit churches if you satisfy the following conditions. If you get the permission of the priest or the monk in that church, if there was no prayer service or mass service occurring in the church at the time. So we began to see an increased awareness by scholars writing the Fada'il al-Quds that Muslims are in fact visiting Christian holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, and they began to address it with using Islamic law, and you see a bifurcation of Islamic rules on this matter. The more conservative Hanbali scholars would say, no, you're not allowed to visit churches, and especially the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. But you see Shafi'i scholars saying, well, you could visit them under certain conditions. So this debate that I found in the Fada'il al-Quds has never been addressed before. In fact, this whole issue of Muslims visiting holy sites has not been addressed extensively in research on the Mamluk period. And those were the findings that I've included in my article. And in fact, this ritual of visiting Christian holy sites even extends to the Ottoman period, as you can see from my article.
You mentioned several times the so-called merits of Jerusalem. Can you tell us something more about this idea? How did the concept of the merits of Jerusalem emerge? How it developed? And also I'm curious about the contemporary, if the merits of Jerusalem are still a sort of a valid idea and concept, and they're still understood as they were originally conceived.
That's an excellent question. You've actually hit the nail on its head in the sense of asking how did the Fada'il al-Quds emerge, and how did they develop, how did they come about, and how they form part of the Islamic discourse today on Jerusalem and Islamic character. Well, what are the Fada'il al-Quds? First of all, the Fada'il al-Quds translates literally to the merits of Jerusalem or the religious excellences of Jerusalem. They are basically a collection, they are texts, and within the text, it's a collection of Qur'anic verses, hadith traditions, sayings of the Prophet's companions, and sayings and traditions from the first generation of Muslims on the sanctity of Jerusalem. So basically, it is a collection of Islamic traditions that serve to sanctify, extol, and attract Muslims to visit Jerusalem. How did they emerge? Well, first of all, one of the most authentic Muslim hadiths on the sayings of the Prophet addressed that Jerusalem, in addition to Mecca and Medina, should be visited by Muslims, and Muslims should undertake a pilgrimage there. This is one of several other hadith traditions on Jerusalem and its status and symbol in Islam. Now, those hadiths obviously emerged during the first century of Islam, during the time of the Prophet, but also their circulation increased a lot during the Umayyad period, which is towards the end of the 7th century, right after the conquest of Jerusalem by Umar ibn al-Khattab, and who is the second Caliph. So the hadiths and the Qur'anic verses and the Qur'anic exegesis, the tafsir on Qur'anic verses that relate to Jerusalem, all those traditions began to circulate extensively in Syria and Palestine during the Umayyad period. Because if you understand early Islamic history, you know that after the death of the Prophet and after the reign of the four rightly guided caliphs, the Umayyads set up their rule and capital in Damascus. So there was a geographical shift of the center and gravity of politics within the Islamic world to Damascus and Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria. So naturally, you would look to holy cities in that region, and Jerusalem helped serve as a spiritual center for the Umayyads. Hence, the building of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque south of it by the Umayyad caliphs, especially Abd al-Malik, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. He built the Dome of the Rock, and his son, and he apparently began building or thinking of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and his son built and finished the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So in order to consolidate the rule and religious character of the Umayyads in Syria, Jerusalem helped serve that, and hence you see Umayyad Caliphs help support, sponsor scholars who would continue to write those traditions and to circulate. Now, during the Abbasid period, which is about a century after, in the 8th and 9th century, you began to see the emergence of the Sahih collection of hadith, such as the Sahih collection of Bukhari, Muslim, At-Tirmidhi. And there you begin to also see the incorporation of all those traditions on Jerusalem in those collections. Then came the 9th century, and we have the first actual collection of all those traditions on Jerusalem emerge in the 9th century, written by a Jerusalemite Palestinian Muslim scholar called al-Ramli. And he basically put together and collected all those traditions on the city in Islam and wrote the first work called Fada'il Bayt al-Maqdis. Now, this book did not survive. However, we know about this book from later Fada'il al-Quds books that were composed especially in the 11th century. And the question is, why is it that more books were composed in the 11th century? Well, that has to do with a few things. One of them, which is the stability that the Fatimids brought to Jerusalem during the 11th century, because the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century was quite dramatic for Jerusalem and Palestine. It's what Moshe Gil refers to as the 60 Years' War, where you have the Fatimids, the Tulunids, the Qarmatians, the Arab Bedouins invading Jerusalem and Palestine. So as you can imagine, there's a significant instability in the region. With the 11th century, you have the stabilization of Jerusalem by the Fatimids, and you begin to see the emergence of two major works on the Fada'il al-Quds, one by al-Wasiti and the other one by Ibn al-Murajja, and they're both Jerusalemite scholars living in the 11th century. I argue in my thesis that the reason why you have those two major works on Fada'il al-Quds collected and written in the 11th century is because this was also the great age of pilgrimage of European Christians. So Muslims, I believe, at that time began to witness a significant increase in Christian pilgrimage to the city. And therefore, they became aware of, they wanted to become more aware of the Islamic character and the Islamic traditions on the city to consolidate the Islamic presence there. And therefore, that is one of my arguments, which is why the 11th century saw the writing of those two major Fada'il al-Quds works. Now, the Fada'il al-Quds works take a significant turn during the age of the Crusades, after the First Crusade, especially during the reign of Nur ad-Din and the famous Salah ad-Din Saladin, and the later Ayyubids, the descendants of Salah ad-Din. Now, the Fada'il al-Quds took more of an ideological turn, in the sense they became shorter compositions rather than those large collections, and they served specifically as an ideological weapon against the Frankish conquest and control of Jerusalem. So they were basically treatises sponsored by sultans fighting the Crusaders, such as Nur ad-Din Zengi and Salah ad-Din, and therefore they were employed to basically mobilize the Muslim populace and the rulers to fight the Franks and to recapture Jerusalem. And we see this with great success, especially during Nur ad-Din's reign, where you have the famous Ibn Asakir family and their scholars that were employed within Nur ad-Din's administration. And they wrote Fada'il al-Quds to basically motivate the troops. And they were read even before the troops went to war against the Franks, even during Saladin's wars against the Franks. Now, in the later medieval period, which is in the Mamluk period, we're talking about 13th to 15th century, and that's after the end of the Crusading Wars and the expulsion of the Franks from Jerusalem and the Mediterranean coast there, you begin to see the significant proliferation of Fada'il al-Quds literature during the Mamluk period, which is a strong indication about the return of an increased Islamic pilgrimage to the city, sponsored by the Mamluks and the Mamluk religious scholars, and therefore the increase in the number of Fada'il al-Quds texts served not only as a sign of the increased sanctification of the city by the Mamluks, but also a sign of the increased Islamic pilgrimage to the city in terms of the number of pilgrims visiting, and the very authors themselves who wrote those Fada'il al-Quds wrote their treatises while they were visiting Jerusalem and staying there and worshiping.
It's such a fascinating story, and I must admit a lot of my ignorance about this particular period in time, despite I had a number of guests discussing medieval Jerusalem during the Crusades, but there's always like new and fascinating aspects that emerge out of that period of time. And in fact, I was curious about something, because obviously you talk about Islamic Jerusalem, particularly in the period after the Crusades, and you also talk about the question of Christian pilgrims. And I remember reading a number of chronicles written by Jewish travelers or pilgrims around this period of time. And I was wondering if, also their chronicles, their Jewish presence is mentioned in Islamic, but also Christian chronicles of that period.
Well, some Jewish holy sites or holy sites that are sacred to both Jews and Muslims are mentioned in the Fada'il al-Quds, such as the Mihrab Dawood, or the oratory of David, which there is a bit of a debate on where its location, but many Fada'il al-Quds refer to it as it's the Tower of David at the Jaffa Gate, which is in the citadel of the city. So we see there Muslims sanctifying that holy site, and in fact, when pilgrims enter the city, they're told to enter and visit Mihrab Dawood there first. There's also the Tomb of David, which is considered in the Mount of Zion and in the Church of Mount of Zion, I think. And that is also mentioned in some of the chroniclers and some of the Fada'il al-Quds literature. But as much as Jewish pilgrims have come to Jerusalem and visited during the medieval period, the Muslim sources are, I wouldn't say silent, but they're not as detailed about those accounts as they are more about Muslims and Muslim holy sites visiting the city and sanctifying those specific holy spots for Muslims. But there is this overlap between Jewish holy sites and Muslim holy sites. And we see during the building of the Dome of the Rock by the Umayyad Abd al-Malik, you see some Jews and Jewish families, how they served as servants inside the Dome of the Rock to help clean it and cleanse it and do certain rituals, as well as some Christians as well who helped in the services of cleaning and maintaining the Dome of the Rock. So we see this picture of some form of, perhaps I would not want to use this word, but some form of cosmopolitan character to Jerusalem and its three monotheistic faiths and their adherents sharing sacred spaces, whether they're Muslims, Jews, or Christians, at certain holy spots and during certain periods in the city.
Well, you don't want to use, and I think rightly so, the word cosmopolitan. That's probably a more modern terms. But I was wondering about the demographic of Jerusalem at this point in time. I mean, it seems to me that obviously there's an Arab component, but you also have a European presence, and I'm pretty sure that there are people from different areas of the Middle East that at some point either settle down or certainly come in and then leave Jerusalem. Can you gather any sort of idea about the demographic of Jerusalem in this moment in time?
Sure. Well, to understand the demographics of Jerusalem is also partly to understand the history of conversions occurring in the Islamic world during the medieval period. So we have evidence from al-Muqaddasi and his geographical multi-volume treatise, Ahkam Afdal Taqasim. Here we see that he refers to Jerusalem during the 9th and 10th century as a city that doesn't have necessarily many Muslim scholars, and instead Christian scholars and Christian priests are actually quite present in the city. And he laments that his city, al-Muqaddasi city, because he's from Jerusalem, does not have this thriving Islamic ulama presence as the case is with the Christians at the time. And he was aware of that. However, during the 11th century, we have records from Nasr Khusro, the Persian pilgrim and traveler who visited Jerusalem in the 11th century, as well as the records from Ibn al-Arabi, the famous Andalusian philosopher and theologian, and al-Tartushi as well. And their record shows that Islamic scholarship, in terms of the number of ulama, the presence of Muslims there, is quite flourishing at the time. And they do refer to a certain extent about the Christian presence there, but in the 11th century, we see writings talking about Muslims and their presence there, and there are many scholars. So it's a reflection of Muslims moving there, perhaps, Muslim pilgrims, obviously, Muslims residing there. But in terms of the record on the Christian presence or Christians from Europe moving there, they speak of European Christian pilgrims. And in fact, one of the most famous accounts in Muqaddasi and other scholars, they speak about the miracle of holy fire that happens inside the church of the Holy Sepulcher during Easter. And they write how there's hundreds, many Christians that come from across the world to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and to witness this event, the miracle of holy fire that occurs during Easter. And interestingly enough, in those accounts, the Muslim chroniclers also write that Muslims are present at this event, the miracle of holy fire, and they're inside the church looking at and participating in this Easter celebration. So in that sense, we have here a reflection of the demographics of Jerusalem at that time. It is only after Saladin's conquest that we see Muslims repopulating the city after almost 90 years of Christian rule there. And especially during the Mamluk period, we have, I would argue, an explosion of Muslim demographics there. Although scholars such as Sheikh and Joseph Mary would basically say that we cannot really put a specific number, calculate a specific number from the sources that we have, but the sources do point to a significant increase in not only Islamic pilgrimage to the city, but also in Muslims moving to Jerusalem and settling there, especially during the Mamluk period.
I love digressing for medieval history of Jerusalem, but I want to go back to the pilgrimage. And I was wondering if you can give us a sample of the places. Obviously, you already mentioned the Holy Sepulcher, but maybe others that were visited by pilgrims, and also the meaning of these places for particularly Islamic and so Muslim pilgrims.
For sure, in order for us to understand the reason for and the places at which Muslims worshipped in Jerusalem, we have to understand why is Jerusalem important in Islam. Well, first of all, Jerusalem is a holy city for the two other monotheistic faiths, Judaism and Christianity. And Islam, emerging in this atmosphere of monotheism in Arabia, was very much aware of Jerusalem's sanctity and sacred role within those traditions. So Jerusalem served as the first qibla, or direction of prayer, by the Prophet Muhammad and his early Muslims, early Muslim community, before he migrated to Medina in the Hijrah, and then he changed the qibla, the direction of prayer, to Mecca. Second of all, in the Islamic tradition, Jerusalem is highly sanctified because Prophet Muhammad performed what we refer to as the al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, which is this nocturnal journey in which the Prophet was translocated from Mecca to Jerusalem during with the Archangel Gabriel, and where he visited Jerusalem on this night journey and worshipped there and prayed there with the other monotheistic prophets. And it is during that nocturnal journey, the Isra night, what we have is the ascension of Muhammad from Jerusalem to the heavens, in which where he met also other prophets and met God, the Lord, and he was instructed on the basic rituals and practices of Islam, such as the performance of the salah, the prayer, and how many times it should be performed every day. So those are the major reasons why Jerusalem is sanctified in Islam. It is also mentioned in the Quran. This Isra night journey was mentioned in the Quran, and the Mufassirs, the Muslim exegetes, explained that this verse 17:1 refers to Prophet Muhammad's Isra journey to Jerusalem. And also the Quran refers to the sanctity of Jerusalem with the traditions on narratives on the ancient Israelites, and they're moving into Palestine and settling in Jerusalem. So it was referred to as al-Ard al-Muqaddasa alladhi barakna hawlaha, etc. So that is the important aspect that we have to understand first, why Jerusalem is very important for Islam. From there, and from those points of importance and sanctity, emerges the circuit of holy sites in Jerusalem, with the epicenter of Islamic pilgrimage being the Haram, al-Sharif, the Temple Mount. And the Dome of the Rock basically is the starting point there for any Muslim visiting Jerusalem and doing the pilgrimage, the ziyarah there. So Muslims would visit the Dome of the Rock, they would enter it, and the Fada'il al-Quds pilgrimage guides, those texts, specifically instruct Muslims how to enter the Haram and how to enter the Dome of the Rock, this beautiful structure that adorns the Haram al-Sharif and is really the symbol today of Jerusalem and in the medieval period. It is this golden dome that lies at the center. And when I teach my students, I always like to show them photos of the Dome of the Rock with people standing right next to it, and you can see how large the structure. In fact, it's people underestimate how large and monumental this place is. The texts instruct Muslims how to specifically enter the Dome of the Rock and from which gate to enter it, and then they would instruct them to visit the Sakhra, the big rock, or the Holy of Holies within the Jewish tradition, and to visit there, to worship there, but not to touch it. For example, there's specific instructions, what Qur'anic verses to read there, and what prostrations, salats, or ruk'ahs to be performed there by Muslims. Then you would visit other spots within the Dome of the Rock, such as the footprints of the Prophet. We have apparently the footprints of the Prophet there that reflect the visit of Prophet Muhammad to the Haram. And then there's that interesting cave, the grotto cave underneath the rock, under the Sahara. And you can see there are stairs there, and you can go underneath the rock, and there's a grotto. It's quite beautiful, actually, and you can pray there. But the holy sites are not just restricted to the Dome of the Rock. Muslims are instructed to visit other sites within the Aqsa Mosque or Al-Jami' al-Aqsa, south of the Dome of the Rock, right to the south of it. And that's where we see today in the tensions between Palestinians and the Israeli authorities and the settlers when they're visiting the Temple Mount al-Haram al-Sharif during the morning, and you see the Muslim Palestinians basically there inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, basically resisting any visits to that spot and protesting there. So there are holy sites within this mosque. And there are other holy sites on the Haram al-Sharif as well, such as other smaller domes like Qubbat al-Silsila, the dome of the chain, Qubbat al-Nabi, the dome of the Prophet, Qubbat Sulaiman, the dome of Solomon, but Sulaiman here referring to the Umayyad Caliph, not Solomon, the biblical king. There are also other holy sites outside the Haram that Muslims visited, such as the walls of the city. They're considered sanctified because they're connected with the apocalypse and the traditions on the end of days. Jerusalem also is sanctified in Islam because it has an important role in the traditions on the end of days and eschatology in Islam, because it is the place where the souls will translocate during the day of judgment. In one Islamic tradition, it is the place where Mecca even will translocate and move to Jerusalem and meet with Jerusalem there. The valley there between the eastern Haram wall and the Mount of Olives is considered the valley of Jahannam, or the valley of hell, for example. We see Jerusalem is also connected to sanctification traditions in Islam because of its role in the apocalypse. And though this role has its holy sites, such as the walls of Jerusalem, for example. And then you have interesting other holy sites that are natural places of nature, such as the spring of Siloam, Ain Silwan, to the south of the city, that Muslims will have to visit, in addition to the Christian sites that I've mentioned, such as the Mount of Olives, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, the Church of the Sepulchre of Mary, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Ascension there as well, and in Bethlehem and Nazareth, the two important churches there. So that is basically an overview of the different holy sites, both Muslim and Christian, that Muslims visited and worshiped there due to their sanctified nature within the tradition.
I have a sort of a personal question. In the article, you talk about the transition to Ottoman rule of Jerusalem. And I was wondering if pilgrimage changed in that period of time, particularly during this transition, and also if locations may have changed. I mean, what I mean is that if there may be new places that pilgrims visited, and maybe older places that have been maybe abandoned or received less attention.
Well, one thing we know in the Ottoman period is that Islamic pilgrimage as an important historical religious phenomenon continued and thrived during the Ottoman period. That's partly due to the Ottoman authorities or the Ottoman Sultan's sponsorship of building projects within the city after the Ottoman conquest. And the Ottoman conquest of Jerusalem and Palestine occurred in 1516 to 1517, just to give listeners a historical context here. So in the beginning of the 16th century, we begin to see the end of Mamluk rule in the Islamic world and the emergence of the Ottoman rule and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire to Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, and Egypt, of course, including Jerusalem and Palestine. So we see, for example, the major building project by the Khalifa, the Sultan Sulaiman the Magnificent, and he built the present walls that are around Jerusalem, in addition to other contributions on the Haram and within the city. Now, in terms of what is new, I would say the literary evidence has changed and changed significantly. The Mamluk period produced the largest number of pilgrimage texts, those Fada'il al-Quds, within Islamic history. In the Ottoman period, ulama scholars continued to compose the Fada'il al-Quds pilgrimage guides, but not to the actual number that were composed in the Mamluk period. But what came instead? Well, the Ottoman period witnesses the emergence of a very rich travelogue literature on Jerusalem. Basically, Muslim travelers from Syria, from al-Maghrib as well, would travel to Jerusalem, undergo pilgrimage ziyarah there, and they would write a full travel book about their experiences and their travels specifically to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, which is something that really was lacking in a sense before the Ottoman period. We have travel literature, travelogues written during the Mamluk period and even in the early Islamic period, such as Nasr Khusro's travel, Muqaddisi's, although it's a geographical encyclopedic work, he does write about his travels. And we have other kind of travel literature, such as al-Harawi, which is really a manual about holy sites, but he includes his travels there. We have travels by Ibn Khaldun written in the Mamluk period, the famous Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Battuta, of course. But none of those texts were specifically about their travels to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. That occurred during the Ottoman period with the works of the very famous Damascene scholar Sheikh al-Nabulsi and al-Luqaymi and al-Bakri. So you have this reservoir of pilgrimage texts, but this time it's pilgrimage travelogue writings. And the authors speak about where they visited in Jerusalem, what they worshipped. Interestingly, in those travelogue works, the authors, such as al-Nabulsi, in his work Al-Hadra al-Unsiyya fi al-Rihla al-Qudsiyya, he specifically quotes the Fada'il al-Quds when he visits every Islamic holy site. He would say, and this holy site is sanctified because based on this Fada'il al-Quds work written by this scholar, he says its importance lies in the following, and we have to do a couple of prostrations there and read a certain Qur'anic chapter here, etc., etc. So within this pool of travel literature, we have an immense and deep reservoir of information on travel to Jerusalem during the Ottoman period. I have referred in my dissertation, which I'm completing now, on the Islamic pilgrimage to Jerusalem during the Ottoman period, specifically in the works of al-Nabulsi and al-Luqaymi. And more work has to be done on those authors, which I will be pursuing next soon after I complete my dissertation, which is in its final stages. And that will be my next project, which is Islamic pilgrimage to Jerusalem during the Ottoman period, and to look at the holy sites there, and to look at whether things changed or places, as you said, might have changed and locations might have moved, which is something that is common in medieval history. For example, I've referred to the Mihrab Dawood, or the oratory of Dawood, location changing during the medieval period, especially during the Mamluk period, being located now, there is a location for it on the Haram rather on the citadel of the city. So again, the Ottoman period needs more investigation, and I'm hopefully going to delve into that next very soon, and after I complete the final steps of my dissertation.
Well, I wish you good luck with all of what you want to do in the project, and I'd be very curious to read in the future, because obviously we know a lot, for instance, about the Nebi Musa festival, which also included a pilgrimage and all of the various groups that were gathering in various parts of Palestine and then obviously made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But obviously Nebi Musa was not the only one, and there are others that perhaps in time have disappeared or lost importance, but they're certainly there for pilgrims.
Well, there's an interesting event, a yearly event, that Nasr Khusro wrote about in the 11th century, which is this practice of ta'rif in Jerusalem. Ta'rif coming from the word Arafah, which refers to Mount Arafah in Mecca. What I'm referring here is to this religious practice that occurred in the medieval period in Jerusalem, where every year during the Hajj season, Nasr Khusro writes about this, and other chroniclers write about this. Muslim pilgrims from across Syria and Palestine who are unable to afford to do the Hajj pilgrimage all the way to Mecca, they would instead come to Jerusalem and celebrate the Hajj season in Jerusalem by doing a ziyarah pilgrimage to the city. And this practice was known as ta'rif, coming from the word Arafah, Mount Arafah in Mecca, which has its important role during the Hajj season on the day of the Feast of Sacrifice on Eid al-Adha. We know that the Hajjaj, the Muslim pilgrims during the Hajj, would go to Mount Arafah there, then that's the climax of the Hajj. At the same time, in Jerusalem, during the medieval period, we have Muslims from Syria and Palestine coming to visit Jerusalem during the Hajj season to perform some kind of ritual that parallels the Hajj and to see it as in lieu of the Hajj because they were unable to go there. A practice which was very common, but it was attacked and critiqued by Hanbali scholars such as the famous Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn al-Jawziyah. So here you see another kind of religious, not festival I would say, but a religious important phenomenon occurring in the medieval period on a yearly basis, which also helped increase Islamic pilgrimage to the city during these centuries.
I want to, come full circle as we reach the end of the interview. You mentioned at the very beginning that looking at medieval Jerusalem may also help understand the current, shall we say, conflict situation between Israel and Palestine. And I was wondering in what ways you think medieval history can help us have a better understanding of the current situation.
Well, the legacy basically of medieval Jerusalem is that fundamentally the Muslim presence in the city is inescapable. And perhaps it constitutes the major part, I would argue, in the urban, architectural, religious, and demographic fabric of the old city today. And like I said, Oleg Grabar, the famous architectural historian, referred to medieval Jerusalem as basically an Islamic city, as in medieval Jerusalem being dominated by the Dome of the Rock, Masjid al-Aqsa, and the Islamic character to it. And scholars today argue that the old city today, as it stands, without including any of the modern Israeli developments and buildings, is actually the Islamic Mamluk city as it stood centuries ago, because again, the Haram dominates the city, the Dome of the Rock dominates the urban architecture and religious character of the city today, the old city, but also all the Mamluk construction of madrasas and lodges and institutions. All this architectural contributions are still present today in the old city. So this is the legacy of medieval Jerusalem, which is, it also comes with the fact that in the medieval centuries, because Muslims dominated the city, that naturally gave rise to political crises or sectarian strife between Christians and Muslims that climaxed, obviously, with the Crusades, with the First Crusade, which, if we look at scholarship about the Crusades, and that began by Professor Barker at the beginning of the 20th century, and he defined what is pilgrimage, but what is the crusade, but pilgrimage under arms. So the instability in Jerusalem during the medieval period and the fear of European Christians having no access to Jerusalem, which is the holy city in Christianity, led to the rise of the Crusades to take over the city and the region and to protect Christian holy sites. So Muslim domination and rule over the city in the medieval period naturally brought forth tensions vis-a-vis other monotheistic religions, which is the same legacy we have today by what we see with the Israeli right-wing efforts to basically dominate the old city and to change perhaps the religious or the demographic fabric and character of the city, is leading to religious tensions between Muslims and Palestinian Christians as well, vis-a-vis the right-wing Israelis and their efforts to basically change the religious character and demographic character of the old city. And we see that today with basically the settlers coming to visit the Haram of Jerusalem, Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount on a weekly basis, causing this very, very tense situation between Palestinians and Israelis. So that would be the legacy of medieval Jerusalem, both positive and perhaps one can say negative.
This was Fadi Ragheb, the Kaka Award winner for 2023 of the Jerusalem Quarterly, with the article Sharing the Holy Land, Islamic Pilgrimage to Christian Holy Sites in Jerusalem during the late medieval and early modern periods. Fadi, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.